This is an orphanage, a haven meant to soothe the hearts of wounded children. Children lived, played, and grew here, but no one could have predicted that this house, born of compassion, would eventually become a living hell that devoured innocent children. And the strange events began from this very day. The story begins in the late spring of 1863, during the American Civil War. Weeks earlier, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had won a brilliant but costly victory at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia. This victory, though inspiring, left his army wounded and depleted. 2 years of war had already drained the surrounding resources. The soldiers were exhausted, and supply lines were on the verge of breaking. General Lee faced only two options: either stay put and wait for the Union Army to recover and attack, or take the offensive and carry the war into the North. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, and General Lee chose the latter. This was the Confederate Army's second large-scale invasion of Union territory, and the largest one yet. Behind this invasion lay a dual purpose. First, on a practical level, the farms of Maryland and Pennsylvania were rich in produce. Soldiers could forage for supplies on the spot, easing the pressure on Virginia's civilians and supply lines. Second, on a political level, if they could win a decisive victory on Northern soil, it would crush the morale of the Northern public, influence the upcoming fall elections, and might even force the Lincoln administration to the negotiating table to end this long war. General Lee's ultimate goal was to destroy the main force of the Union Army in a single battle. As long as he could do that on Northern soil, the Union's war effort would be thrown into chaos, and the Confederacy could seize the initiative in the war. And this battle that would decide the nation's fate ultimately and unexpectedly took place in a small town with no strategic value: Gettysburg. It was unexpected because neither General Lee nor the Union commanders at the time ever intended to fight at Gettysburg. It was simply because the town sat at the intersection of several major roads, making it a natural point of contact when armies were on the move. On the morning of July 1st, 1863, a Confederate unit advanced toward Gettysburg. Their original intention was simple: to find supplies, especially shoes. After long marches, many soldiers' shoes were already worn out. Their feet were bleeding, but they never expected to encounter Union cavalry here, and an unexpected skirmish broke out. The fighting escalated from early morning, with infantry from both sides arriving one after another. What started as a small clash gradually grew into a large-scale fierce battle. General Lee realized this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. At this moment, the Union line was weak and loosely deployed, highly vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. In the afternoon, two Confederate units launched a fierce attack from the north and northwest. The Union line collapsed instantly, and the soldiers fell into chaos, retreating in disgrace along the streets of Gettysburg. They finally fell back to Cemetery Hill south of the town. During this chaotic retreat, Sergeant Amos Humiston of the 154th New York Infantry found himself in a desperate situation. He and his comrades were covering the Union retreat near a workshop on the edge of town. They took cover behind a picket fence and held their ground, but before long, they came under heavy fire from two Confederate units, and their line was on the verge of collapse. When the line was finally broken, Amos ran desperately toward the safety of Cemetery Hill, but he didn't get far before a bullet struck him. The fatal wound brought him down not far from the battlefield. As the din of battle faded away, Amos's consciousness began to blur. He struggled to reach out and fumble for something he always carried close to him: a small photograph his wife had sent him a few weeks earlier. In the photo were his 3 children. He clutched the photo tightly, and the smiling faces of his children flashed through his mind. Perhaps he was thinking that he would never return to them, never hold them again. In the end, Amos closed his eyes forever on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, his hands still clutching that photograph that held all his love and longing. 3 days later, the battle ended, and the town of Gettysburg began its difficult rebuilding. A local woman, while cleaning up the battlefield, found Amos's body. Like thousands of other fallen soldiers on the battlefield, he had no identification on him. His identity could not be confirmed, but what made him different was that he was clutching that photograph tightly in his hand. The woman took the photograph from Amos's hand and gave it to his father, whose name history only records as Mr. Shriver. Before long, Mr. Shriver showed the photograph to Dr. John Francis Bournes. Dr. Bournes was a volunteer surgeon at the time, who had been treating the wounded at Gettysburg throughout the battle. When he saw the photograph and heard the story behind it, he was deeply moved. An unknown fallen soldier, clutching his children's photo even at the moment of death. And those children might still be waiting far away for their father to return, not knowing that he had already remained forever on that battlefield. This sorrow pierced Dr. Bourne's heart, and he was determined to find out the identity of the soldier, contact his family, and let them know what had happened to their loved one. Thanks to Dr. Bourne's efforts, the story of this photograph began to circulate locally. Newspapers reported the event in detail, describing the details in the photograph. Although the photograph itself was never published, the story of this unknown soldier and his 3 children quickly spread across the entire country. It touched the hearts of countless people. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away from Gettysburg, Amos's wife Fanny was anxiously waiting for news of her husband. Like all families of soldiers on the front lines back then, she was already used to long waits and silence. In the summer of 1863, weeks went by. She still hadn't received any letters from Amos, and as time passed, unease and worry gradually enveloped her. When the newspaper began describing in detail the photo in the hands of the unknown soldier, Fanny recognized it at a glance. It was the very photo she had sent to Amos a month earlier. It wasn't until October that the truth finally reached her ears. Amos had died on the battlefield. For Dr. Bourne, this photo had long surpassed the scope of a personal tragedy. It became a symbol of the devastation war inflicted on countless families. Countless soldiers like Amos had fallen, leaving behind widows and orphans like Fanny and her children, struggling in loneliness and poverty. Even after Amos's identity was confirmed, Dr. Bourne still worried about Fanny's family. He began to think about what he could do to help these war orphans. He started making copies of this photo and selling them for a small fee. He claimed that all proceeds would go to support Amos's family and more children who had lost their fathers serving in the Union Army. At this time, Gettysburg was deeply immersed in the trauma of war. The devastation of the battle swept through the entire town, shattering countless families. Fathers died on the battlefield, and mothers either perished from poverty and disease or were unable to raise their children. More and more orphans were left homeless and displaced, and the town simply didn't have enough resources to care for them. Seeing all this, Dr. Bourne conceived an even grander idea: to establish a permanent home where the children of Union soldiers who had lost their fathers in the war could find refuge. The photo Amos clutched tightly as he lay dying became the cornerstone of this idea. Soon, plans to establish the orphanage began to move forward, and the site was chosen on the Gettysburg battlefield. A place that had witnessed so much suffering was now to become a haven protecting the most vulnerable in war. This idea received support from the local community. People donated money and goods to contribute to the establishment of the orphanage. The decision was made. The building intended for the orphanage had actually been built back in 1836, 30 years before the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. In that battle, this building, located on Baltimore Street at the north side of Cemetery Hill, was right in the heart of the battlefield and was used as a Union field hospital. Imagine the scene back then. Wounded soldiers were carried into the building in an endless stream, and the rooms were crowded with the injured. Surgeons performed operations under crude conditions. Amputations were everywhere, and severed limbs were piled up outside. After the war ended, the stench of death lingered over the town for weeks. Local residents even had to soak handkerchiefs in lavender or peppermint oil and cover their noses and mouths just to walk the streets. It's estimated that over 7,000 people died during the 3-day battle, and the total death toll during the entire American Civil War reached a staggering 620,000. That was equivalent to 2% of the total U.S. population at the time. It was against this backdrop that the Gettysburg National Home, also known as the legendary Gettysburg Orphanage, was officially born. On November 20th, 1866, the Gettysburg Orphanage officially opened its doors. Among the first group of children to move in were Fanny and her 3 children. Dr. Bourne invited Fanny to serve as the orphanage's first director. Fanny accepted. She moved to Gettysburg with her children, hoping to start a new life there and also hoping to help more orphans like her own children. In the early days, the orphanage housed about 30 to 35 children. But as more and more orphans were brought in, the number quickly increased. The building became overcrowded. To accommodate more children, the orphanage had to be expanded. After the expansion, it could hold up to 80 to 100 children at a time. Despite the limited space, the atmosphere at the orphanage was very warm. The children ate meals on time, wore clean clothes, and received a proper education. They also had plenty of free time to play. They would run and play outdoors, and also participate in community activities, becoming a warm site in the town of Gettysburg. The success of this orphanage even attracted visits from notable figures of the time, including a Union Army general, who later became President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. For many people, the Gettysburg Orphanage was a symbol of America's attempt to heal the wounds of war and care for its war orphans, a ray of light in the darkness. But no one could have imagined that this light would soon be completely swallowed by darkness. In 1869, 3 years after the orphanage began operating, Fanny remarried and moved to Massachusetts, leaving the orphanage without a manager. The orphanage's board of directors found themselves in a difficult situation. They sought guidance from Dr. Bournes, asking what they should do next. Dr. Bournes recommended a woman named Rosa Carmichael, claiming she was experienced and very suitable for the position of director. Rosa claimed to have extensive experience caring for children and also described herself as a strict disciplinarian. With Dr. Bournes' strong recommendation, the board quickly approved Rosa's appointment. In 1870, Rosa officially became the new director of the Gettysburg Orphanage. But from the moment she stepped into the orphanage, the atmosphere there completely changed. Under Fanny's management, the orphanage was full of routine, order, safety, and stability. The children felt cared for and warm. But Rosa's management style was centered on harsh discipline and cruel punishment. She had never married and had no children of her own. According to many accounts, he had almost no patience for the orphanage children, even showing a strange aversion to them. But at first, these changes went unnoticed by the outside world. The orphanage continued to operate as usual, with no official body overseeing it. It was a private institution. As long as the children had a place to stay and food to eat, few raised questions. But within the orphanage walls, fear had replaced warmth, and silence had replaced laughter. The children became increasingly quiet and rarely played outside anymore. The sense of safety and belonging had completely vanished. As Rosa solidified his position as director, he became the king of the place. The children's meals became smaller and more irregular, and they often went hungry. Their clothes were worn out with no repairs or replacements, and many children had to wear thin, tattered garments. They shivered in the cold winter. Later investigations and the recollections of former orphans pieced together a heartbreaking picture. Rosa relied on humiliation and physical torment to force the children into submission. His cruelty was beyond anyone's imagination. Older orphans were often chained to the walls of the orphanage basement, isolated day after day, unable to communicate with anyone. For the younger children, whose wrists were too small for chains, Rosa devised another method, a more cruel form of punishment. He put the children in wooden barrels filled with cold water and tied their wrists to the sides to prevent them from slipping and drowning. For children whose height was almost the same as the barrel, the pain and exhaustion from this punishment were fatal. They could barely stand, enduring the cold water and physical agony. Another punishment was forcing children to stand for long periods. Rosa would make them stand on chairs or tables and order them not to move. If they collapsed from exhaustion, they would face even harsher punishment. They would be accused of disobedience. The cruelest punishment took place in the basement, a small, dark, windowless space the children called the pit. Only a few feet wide, at the end of a dark corridor, children locked in there were tied to the wall. They were held in complete darkness for days. Witnesses recalled that rats even gnawed at their feet while they were bound, and they were powerless to do anything. The abuse wasn't limited to inside the orphanage. In the backyard, children were sometimes tied to pointed fences. They were exposed to the scorching summer heat, unable to move for long periods. Others recalled that stray dogs would wander by, barking and biting at them while they were tied there, and Rosa stood by, watching coldly. It's hard to imagine the pain these children endured. They had already lost their fathers to the war, and some had lost all their relatives. Their hearts were already filled with trauma and fear. Rosa's abuse was like rubbing salt into their wounds, pushing them into deeper despair. This cruel treatment continued for years, with no one intervening. If not for a series of unexpected events, this dark chapter of history might have been buried forever. The first to break the silence was a boy named Robert Turner, who suddenly and mysteriously died while living at the orphanage. Faced with the child's death, Rosa vaguely claimed he had died of illness. He neither called a doctor to examine him nor recorded any details of Robert's death. Instead, he secretly buried him in the orphanage's backyard. It wasn't until much later that authorities learned of this and launched an investigation. When Robert's body was exhumed for an autopsy, the truth was shocking. He hadn't died of illness at all. He had died of starvation. This discovery confirmed the rumors that had been circulating in town for a long time. The orphanage children were suffering inhumane treatment. Around the same time, another incident further heightened public concern. On Christmas Eve of 1876, cemetery caretakers, returning from a church service, passed by the orphanage and suddenly heard a child's cries for help coming from behind the building. They immediately went to check and found a boy named George London locked inside an outdoor toilet. It was a freezing night with extremely low temperatures, and George was nearly frozen. This was all Rosa's punishment. He had locked George in the toilet, leaving him to struggle in the cold wind. Meanwhile, he stayed in his warm room, ignoring George's cries for help. By this time, the orphanage children were in utter despair. One of the older boys, Richard Hutchison, had been Rosa's enforcer. The other children called him Stick. They called him that because he always carried a stick. He beat other children at Rosa's command, but no one knew that Richard's obedience might have been just to protect himself, to avoid becoming a target of abuse. Finally, one night, Richard decided to expose Rosa's crimes. He secretly escaped the orphanage, walked about 20 miles to the neighboring town of Waynesboro, and reported the abuse suffered by the Gettysburg orphanage children to local officials. Richard's action was the first crack in Rosa's facade, and more people began to pay attention to this seemingly respectable orphanage. In the spring of 1876, another event brought public outrage to a peak. During Gettysburg's annual Memorial Day parade, the orphanage children were absent. In many previous years, these children would go to the National Cemetery to lay flowers on the graves of fallen soldiers. Their presence was one of the most moving parts of the parade, and their absence immediately caught the attention of locals. People began to ask where the children were. Questions arose about the orphanage's operations, and eventually the Gettysburg chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic launched an investigation. Rosa was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse. Disappointingly, in court, Rosa was only found guilty of one charge: locking George in the outdoor toilet on Christmas Eve. The punishment for this crime was merely a $25 fine, plus court costs, and she was ordered to leave. Under Gettysburg's legal system at the time, this was already the harshest punishment for a female abuser. But for the children who had suffered years of abuse, such a punishment was nothing more than a drop in the bucket, utterly unable to compensate for the pain they had endured. Rosa herself always denied all the accusations, claiming these charges were fabricated to ruin her reputation. She even refused to leave Gettysburg and continued working at the orphanage for several more months. For the children, those months were undoubtedly another nightmare. But just when people thought this nightmare would continue, Rosa suddenly disappeared, just as she had suddenly appeared in Gettysburg. Overnight, she was gone, never to be seen again. Her disappearance sparked all sorts of speculation around town. Birth records were chaotic back then, and identification was easy to forge. A person could simply change their name and start a new life somewhere else. So some speculated that Rosa simply assumed a new identity, found a job in another town, and continued living. Others guessed that she might have contacted Dr. Burns, who had recommended her to the orphanage, and with his help found a new hiding place. There were even darker rumors that local residents, enraged by Rosa's crimes, decided to take the law into their own hands. They formed a mob, killed Rosa, and buried her body in a field outside town. But none of these speculations had any evidence to support them. Rosa's ultimate fate remains a mystery, buried in the dust of history. After Rosa disappeared, the dark truth of the Gettysburg orphanage wasn't immediately known nationwide. It wasn't until June 1877 that a Philadelphia newspaper published the detailed accounts of the children's abuse at the orphanage, and this hidden history was finally fully exposed. In the public eye, as public scrutiny grew stricter, people's trust in the orphanage completely collapsed. This institution, once seen as a symbol of goodwill, could no longer continue operating. In December 1877, the Gettysburg Orphanage officially closed its doors forever. Rosa had vanished, and the children were transferred to other welfare institutions. This nightmare that had lasted for years finally came to an end, but the story didn't stop there. When people's attention shifted away from Rosa's abusive behavior, another person's true face gradually came to light. He was the founder of the Gettysburg Orphanage, Dr. Burns, once regarded as a philanthropist. All along, Dr. Burns had presented himself as a philanthropist who was moved by Amos's story and cared deeply for the orphans of war. But later revelations showed that his so-called charity was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated scam. The funds raised from selling Amos's photos, the money people donated to the orphanage for the children's food, clothing, and education, most of it was pocketed by Dr. Burns. The children received almost no support at all. Even more disgraceful, the photo Amos clutched tightly before his death was never returned to Fanny's family. Dr. Burns likely sold that photograph of special significance just to profit from it. Yet even so, Dr. Burns never faced any real punishment. His financial fraud wasn't as shocking as Rosa's physical abuse, and it didn't attract enough attention. In the end, the matter was quietly dropped. He got off scot-free, without paying any price for his actions. However, just when everyone thought the matter was settled, a pair of explorers told the media that they had found an adult skeleton in a deep pit at the orphanage, its legs chained to the wall, a miserable sight. Some suspected this person was Rosa, but who killed her? Could it have been one of the orphanage children? But since DNA technology didn't exist at the time, the identity of the deceased couldn't be confirmed. After that, rumors about this punishment room grew more and more. Visitors who went there said that the basement would often experience sudden drops in temperature, and the air was filled with a heavy, oppressive feeling. There was also an indescribable sadness that struck without warning, making it hard to breathe. Some said that, in the empty rooms, they heard faint whispers and cries of children, voices young but filled with despair. Others said their clothes were tugged by something, especially around the legs and hems, as if tiny hands were pulling at them, seeking help. There were also rumors that on dusty surfaces and windows, handprints would appear for no apparent reason. Those handprints were all very small, clearly those of children. The most commonly seen paranormal phenomenon was the ghost of a little girl wearing a worn-out, old-fashioned dress. Those who saw her said the little girl would always stand there quietly, staring ahead, then suddenly vanish into thin air. Her figure sometimes appeared upstairs, sometimes in the basement. Many believed she was one of the children who had suffered and died under Rosa's abuse, though no one knew exactly who she was. Others claimed to have seen Rosa's ghost, tall and stern, exactly as people remembered her. Beyond that, there were subtler paranormal phenomena. Lights with modern wiring would flicker for no reason, and doors would suddenly open or close without anyone touching them. Almost everyone who spent time in the building felt uneasy when leaving the basement. They would become emotional, even tearful, without knowing why, as if the suppressed pain and despair were still trapped in the building, affecting everyone who entered. Today, the orphanage has become one of the world's most famous haunted locations. It has been included in walking tours, telling both the history of the Battle of Gettysburg and the dark past of the orphanage. Even more shocking, disturbing discoveries continue to be made in the old building. In 2025, during restoration work, workers found what is believed to be a child's left rib. This discovery reopened old wounds and reminded people that the building's history still holds many mysteries. We may never know how many horrific crimes were committed there, nor will we ever know how much pain and despair those children endured. The story of the Gettysburg Orphanage is one of contradictions. It began with the purest kindness but ultimately descended into the darkest evil. It was meant to be a place of salvation, yet it became a living hell. That concludes today's story. Thank you for listening. Remember to like, subscribe, and save. See you next time.